The dawn broke like a raw wound over the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, spilling a pale, bloodless light into the canyon below. It was a light that offered no warmth, only revelation. Jack Rourke saw it first, as a smudge of black smoke against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky, a greasy column rising where no smoke should be. He reined in Solomon, his steady sorrel gelding, and the horse snorted a plume of white vapor in the chill air. The wind, a lonely whisper through skeletal rock formations, and stunted juniper carried a scent that turned Jack's stomach, burnt, wood-scorched leather, and the coppery tang of death. He dismounted, pulling his Winchester from its scabbard. His movements were fluid, economical, the ingrained habit of a man for whom caution was a second skin. He moved down the rocky incline, his boots making no sound on the gravelly earth. The source of the smoke came into view around a sharp bend in the trail, a stagecoach or what was left of it. It lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its frame splintered and blackened. One wheel was a shattered ruin, the others pointing uselessly toward the indifferent sky. The scorched red earth was a canvas of chaos, littered with overturned trunks, scattered luggage, and the still twisted forms of the horses, their bodies riddled with bullet holes. Jack's gaze swept the scene, his eyes the color of faded denim, missing nothing. 4 passengers by his count, 3 men and a woman, their bodies sprawled in the unnatural postures of sudden, violent death. Flies were already gathering. He felt a familiar cold stillness settle in his gut, the dull ache of a world that never stopped finding new ways to be cruel. He'd seen this before, too many times. Ambush, robbery, a brutal, senseless end on a lonely stretch of trail. He was about to turn away to leave the dead to their silence and continue his own solitary journey when a low moan snagged his attention. It was faint, almost lost beneath the whistle of the wind, but it was unmistakably human. Jack's head snapped toward the wreckage. He moved closer, his rifle held ready, circling the coach until he saw her. A woman was pinned beneath the heavy overturned chassis, her fine traveling dress torn and stained with blood and dirt. Her dark hair was matted against a face pale as porcelain, but she was alive. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached a deep, hazy blue, clouded with pain and confusion. Her lips cracked and dry moved, forming a single desperate word. "Emma." "Easy now, ma'am," Jack said, his voice a low rumble, intentionally calm. He knelt, assessing the weight of the coach. "You're pinned pretty good. I'll get you out." Her gaze was frantic, unfocused. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice a raw thread of sound. "Emma. She was with me. Please, find her." The plea ripped through the carefully constructed armor around Jack's heart. A child. There was a child involved in this carnage. He scanned the surrounding area with a new, desperate urgency. He saw no small body among the dead, a fact that sent a sliver of hope through him. But where would a little girl go? The canyon walls were steep and the landscape unforgiving. "I'll find her." He promised, the words leaving his mouth before he could weigh their cost. He looked into the woman's eyes and saw the terror of a mother who was living her final nightmare. "What's your name?" "Catherine Hartwell." She breathed, a tremor running through her. Her eyes started to close. "Catherine, stay with me," Jack said, his voice sharp. "I need you to stay awake. Talk to me. Tell me about Emma." He worked as he spoke, searching for a leverage point, a way to shift the immense weight of the coach without causing it to crush her further. He found a sturdy length of splintered timber and began to wedge it beneath the frame. "She's 4, Catherine managed her breath, coming in ragged gasps. Dark hair, like mine. Blue eyes. She was wearing a yellow dress. Her voice broke. She gets scared in the dark. Jack's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the bone. The sun was rising higher, but the shadows in the canyon were still long and deep. He put his shoulder to the timber muscles, straining the wood, groaning in protest. The coach shifted just an inch, but it was enough. He repositioned the lever, grunting with the effort. "I'm going to find her, Catherine." He repeated, as much for himself as for her. He tasted the grit of sand between his teeth, a bitter reminder of the land's unforgiving nature. "You just hold on." The coach moved again, and with a final desperate shove, he created enough space for her to be pulled free. He eased her out gently, his hands surprisingly deft for their size and callous texture. Her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, broken and bleeding, and a dark stain was spreading across her side. She was fading fast. He made her as comfortable as he could, using a traveling cloak from a nearby trunk as a pillow. He gave her a sip of water from his canteen, then stood, his gaze sweeping the desolate landscape again. "Emma," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Emma Hartwell, it's all right to come out now." There was no answer but the wind. He searched for tracks, his eyes tracing the patterns in the dust. He found them near a cluster of boulders, tiny footprints scrambled and desperate, leading away from the carnage and toward a narrow crevice in the rock face. He approached the crevice, slowly holstering his rifle. "Emma," he said softly. "My name is Jack. I'm a friend of your mama's. She sent me to find you." A tiny whimper answered him from the darkness within. Jack knelt, peering into the shadows. He could just make out a small shape huddled at the back of the fissure. He saw the flash of a yellow dress. "It's okay, little one." He said, his voice gentle, the same tone he'd once used to calm spooked horses and his own frightened son. "The bad men are gone. I'm here to take you back to your mama." Slowly, hesitantly, she crawled forward. A little girl with tangled dark hair and wide, terrified blue eyes, her face streaked with tears and dirt. In her small, clenched fist, she clutched a small, worn wooden bird, its paint faded and chipped from countless hours of play. The sight of the toy hit Jack like a physical blow. The air grew thin in his lungs. He was thrown back 3 years to a cold winter morning, and another small hand, holding a similar object, a crudely carved wooden horse. His son Thomas had never been without it. It had been buried with him. The memory, sharp and brutal, tore through him, stripping away the years of detachment he'd so carefully cultivated. This wasn't just another stranger's tragedy. This was personal. The grief he'd been running from had finally caught up to him in a dusty canyon, in the face of a little girl who had lost everything. He saw his own failure reflected in her terrified eyes. He hadn't been there to save his family. But he was here now. Emma finally emerged into the light, blinking against the brightness. She looked at him, her small chest heaving with silent sobs. He held out a hand, palm up. After a long moment, she placed her small hand in his, her fingers barely wrapping around his own. He gently squeezed a silent promise. As he led her back towards the wreckage, back towards her wounded mother, he knew his own journey had just irrevocably changed. He was no longer just a man running from ghosts. He was a man with a purpose, a debt to the past he could only repay in the present. The realization didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an anchor. Catherine's eyes were open when they returned, a flicker of fierce, desperate life igniting in their depths as she saw Emma. "Oh, my baby," she sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand. Emma ran to her, collapsing against her mother's uninjured side. "Mama," she cried, the single word containing a universe of fear and relief. Jack watched them, a sentinel standing over a fragile island of survival in a sea of death. He knew Catherine needed a doctor, and soon. Millhaven was the closest town, a hard day's ride south. too far for a woman with a broken leg and a gunshot wound to the side. He saw the dark, wet stain on her dress, now the work of a bullet, not just shrapnel. These weren't just robbers. They were murderers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice pulling Catherine's gaze away from her daughter. "We need to get you to a doctor. Town called Millhaven is the best bet, but it's a long way." Catherine's expression shifted. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a bedrock of resolve. She tried to push herself up, a sharp cry of pain escaping her lips before she fell back. Her gaze fell to the simple gold band on her left hand, worn thin from years of wear. With trembling fingers, she began to work it off. "Please," she said, her voice strained with effort and exhaustion. "Take this. It's all I have left. Get my daughter to town. Find someone. A minister, a good family. Someone who can care for her. Just get her away from here." Her willingness to sacrifice her last possession, to give up her child to save her, spoke of a desperation that clawed at Jack. He shook his head, pushing her hand gently back. "I'm not leaving you, and I'm not taking your ring. We all go, or none of us do." But how she whispered, gesturing weakly at her shattered leg. "I'll figure it out," he said with a certainty he didn't feel. He turned to Emma, who was watching him with those wide, unnervingly perceptive eyes. "Emma, I need you to be very brave for me. Can you do that?" The little girl nodded solemnly, her hand still clutching the wooden bird. "Is my mama going to sleep forever like my papa?" she asked, her voice small but clear. The question was a clean, sharp blade to Jack's heart. He knelt, bringing himself down to her level. The artifice of the stoic drifter fell away, leaving only the memory of a father who had once answered similar questions. "No, little one," he said, his voice thick. "Your mama is a fighter, but she's hurt bad. We need to help her. We need to be strong for her." He spent the next hour working with a grim efficiency. He salvaged what he could from the wreckage, a tattered quilt, a small cask of water, and a length of rope. From the splintered frame of the coach, he fashioned a crude travois, a dragging sled he could pull behind Solomon. It was a clumsy, agonizingly slow way to travel, but it was their only option. As he worked, he pieced together their story from Catherine's feverish, fragmented whispers and Emma's childlike observations. They were from Kansas. Her husband James had been a farmer. There was a debt not his, but his brother's, a man named Robert. Men had come to collect. James had stood up to them. And now he was gone. Catherine had packed what she could, taking Emma, and fleeing west toward family in California she wasn't even sure would take them in. The men had followed. The ambush wasn't a robbery. It was an execution. They were hunting her. The name Robert snagged in Jack's memory, but it was common enough. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the immediate problem. He carefully loaded Catherine onto the travois, her face tight with pain. He lifted Emma onto Solomon's saddle, placing the little girl in front of him. "Hold on tight to the horn," he instructed, his arms circling her as he took the reins. Solomon, patient and steady, accepted the extra burden without complaint. As they began the slow, torturous journey out of the canyon, Jack's gaze swept back over the scene of the massacre. He felt a cold rage settle deep in his bones. These men hadn't just killed. They had shattered a family, orphaned a child, and left a woman to die in the dirt. He had spent 3 years running from violence, trying to convince himself it wasn't his fight anymore. But looking down at the small head of dark hair resting against his chest, feeling the trust in the small body nestled in his arms, he knew he had been wrong. This was his fight now. The sun was a merciless hammer against the anvil of the desert. The landscape shimmered with heat, the scorched red earth cracking under a sky the color of bleached bone. Every jostle of the travois sent a fresh wave of agony through Catherine. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her moans a constant grim counterpoint to the creak of leather and the soft plod of Solomon's hooves. Jack walked beside the horse, his hand on the lead rope, his eyes scanning the horizon. He'd wrapped a wet cloth around Catherine's forehead, but her fever was climbing. The bullet wound in her side was inflamed the edges an angry red. Infection was setting in. He knew the signs. If they didn't reach Millhaven by nightfall, she wouldn't see another dawn. Emma was quiet, her small body rigid in the saddle. She held the wooden bird so tightly, her knuckles were white. For hours she said nothing, simply watching the unforgiving landscape slide by. Then, in a voice so soft Jack almost missed it, she began to speak. "My papa made this for me," she said, holding up the bird. "He said it was a bluebird for happiness. He said as long as I had it, I'd remember that happiness was real, even when I couldn't see it." Jack's throat tightened. He sounds like a good man. He was the best man, Emma said with the simple finality of a child. "He taught me how to plant seeds. He said you have to be patient and give them water and keep the weeds away. He said that's what families do. They help each other grow." She looked at her mother's still form on the travois. "Mama's seeds are getting weeds now, aren't they?" The question, so innocent and yet so profound, left Jack speechless. He could only nod his gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon that promised nothing but more hardship. As the afternoon wore on, his own, ghosts began to stir. The relentless sun and the rhythm of their slow trek became a canvas for his memory. He found himself lost in a waking nightmare, back in the sun-blasted plains of Arizona. He was in his cavalry blues again, and the air thick with gun smoke and the screams of dying men. It was the mission that had broken him, a disastrous ambush. He and his comrade Robert Kane were cut off from their unit, pinned down behind a rock outcropping. Robert was hit a bad wound in the gut. He'd begged Jack to leave him to save himself. And Jack had. He had run following orders to retreat, leaving his friend to die. He'd told himself it was the only choice, but the guilt had festered a poison that had eventually cost him everything. When he finally returned home weeks later, his wife Mary and his son Thomas were gone, taken by the fever that had swept through the fort in his absence. He'd arrived only in time to see the fresh mounds of earth in the cemetery. The name echoed in his mind, a tolling bell. Robert Kane, the brother whose debt had destroyed the Hartwell family. Coincidence? The world was full of them, but a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. The past was never as buried as you thought. A sudden cry from Emma snapped him back to the present. "Look," she was pointing to the east, her small finger trembling. Jack's eyes followed her gesture. On a distant ridge, two riders were silhouetted against the sky. They were too far to make out details, but they were watching their stillness, a predatory threat. The hunters. They'd found the trail. "It's okay," Jack said, forcing a calm he didn't feel into his voice. He urged Solomon into a slightly faster pace, the travois bumping and scraping over the rough ground. Catherine cried out in her delirium. "Just a couple of travelers, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But Emma knew. Children always knew. "They're the bad men, aren't they?" she whispered. "They've come to finish us." Jack didn't answer. He just kept moving, the weight of the two lives entrusted to him pressing down heavier than the desert sun. The riders on the ridge disappeared, but he knew they were still there, flanking them, herding them. They weren't in a hurry. They were enjoying the chase. They were letting the desert do their work for them. The race against time infection and the approaching riders became a desperate, grueling ordeal. By late afternoon, Catherine was burning with fever, her ramblings incoherent. Jack's own water was nearly gone. His lips cracked, his body aching with fatigue. But every time he looked at Emma's determined face, every time he heard Catherine's weak moans, he found a new reserve of strength. He pushed on, driven by a promise made in a canyon of death. Milhaven appeared like a mirage, a cluster of weathered buildings shimmering in the long, distorted shadows of dusk. Hope, sharp and painful, flared in Jack's chest. He half ran the last mile, dragging the travois Solomon, stumbling with exhaustion behind him. He burst through the door of the doctor's office without ceremony, Catherine's limp form in his arms. "Help her," he rasped, his voice raw from thirst and dust. "Gunshot wound, fever." Dr. Samuel Morrison, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary competence, took one look and sprang into action. "Bring her in back. Lay her on the table." The next few hours were a blur of antiseptic smells, hushed commands, and the clink of metal instruments. Jack stood in the corner, a useless silent spectator, while Emma sat ramrod straight in a wooden chair, her eyes fixed on her mother, her hand never releasing the small wooden bird. She refused to leave, and the doctor, after one look at her fierce, protective gaze, didn't argue. Dr. Morrison worked with steady, practiced hands, cleaning the wound, removing fragments of cloth, and stitching the torn flesh. "Infection's deep," he muttered more to himself than to Jack. "She's lost a lot of blood. It'll be a miracle if she lasts the night." But Catherine Hartwell, it turned out, was made of stronger stuff than even the doctor knew. She had a reason to live, and that reason was sitting in a chair across the room, watching with unwavering faith. As the doctor applied the final bandage, Catherine's eyes fluttered open. Her gaze found Emma, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Mama," Emma whispered, sliding off the chair and creeping to the bedside. "My brave girl," Catherine breathed, her voice barely audible. Her gaze shifted, finding Jack in the shadows. Confusion, then gratitude dawned in her eyes. "You." "He saved us," Mama Emma said, her voice filled with awe. "He's Jack." "Thank you," Catherine whispered to him, the words carrying the weight of a life restored. Jack just knotted the knot in his chest, too tight for words. He felt like an imposter accepting thanks for a rescue that was far from over. The riders from the ridge were still out there. Millhaven wasn't a sanctuary. It was just the next battlefield. He paid for a room at the boarding house across the street, carrying Catherine as gently as he could and tucking her into a real bed. He bought food from the eatery next door, and for the first time in days, they ate a hot meal. Emma, exhausted but relieved, fell asleep in a chair, her head pillowed on her arms. Jack sat by the window, watching the street, his Colt resting on his thigh. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. He needed to know what he was up against. Leaving the door to their room slightly ajar, he slipped out into the cool night air and made his way to the only place in a town like this that would still be open and full of information: the saloon. The saloon was sparsely populated, a few weary cowboys and a grizzled prospector nursing their drinks. Jack took a spot at the end of the bar, ordering a whiskey he didn't intend to drink. He listened to the low hum of conversation, catching snippets about cattle prices and the lack of rain. It was the sheriff who approached him. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a lanky man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. "You're the fella who brought in the Hartwell woman," he said, his voice a low drawl. It wasn't a question. "Reckon so," Jack replied, not turning from his vigil of the street. "Heard she was shot up bad, pursued." Jack's hand instinctively moved closer to his gun. "She's under my protection." "Easy, friend," Bradley said, raising a placating hand. "I'm on your side. Had a couple of hard cases ride through this afternoon. Asking about a woman and a child. Said she was running from a debt owed to their boss, a big cattle baron from up north. Silas Kane." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Kane. The same name as the man he'd left to die. A cold dread, sharp and specific, washed over Jack. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. They didn't find her. Jack stated, his voice flat. Nope. They rode out. But they'll be back. Men like that don't give up. Bradley's eyes narrowed. There's something you ain't telling me, ain't there? This is more than just a debt. Jack was silent for a long moment. He looked at the sheriff at the worn star pinned to his vest and made a decision. He couldn't fight this alone. The debt story is a lie, he said quietly. They ambushed her stagecoach, killed everyone else. They were hunting her. The sheriff swore under his breath. Why? I don't know, Jack lied, but a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in his mind, a puzzle of vengeance and mistaken identity with Catherine and Emma caught in the middle. He left the saloon and walked the dark, dusty street, his mind racing. He needed a plan. He needed to understand the game he was in. His steps led him almost unconsciously to the sheriff's office. A single lamp burned inside. Pinned to a board on the wall was a collection of wanted posters. He scanned the faces, the names, the crimes. And then he saw it. It was a fresh poster, the ink barely dry. The crudely drawn face was meant to be his. The name was Jack Rourke. The crime was horse theft and murder committed in the territory controlled by one man, Silas Kane. And the bounty was $500, dead or alive. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The ambush, the pursuit, the wanted poster. Catherine and her tragic story were just a cover, a means to an end. She wasn't the target. He was. Silas Kane wasn't just a cattle baron collecting a debt. He was hunting the man who he believed had abandoned his brother. He had set a trap using a desperate woman and her child as bait, and Jack had walked right into it. The next 2 days were a quiet torment. Catherine's strength slowly returned, but the town of Millhaven, once a symbol of hope, began to feel like the closing jaws of a trap. The poster was working. Jack saw it in the way the townsfolk looked at him, the suspicious glances, the mothers pulling their children closer as he passed. The story spread like a prairie fire. The stranger who'd brought in the wounded woman was a wanted killer himself. He was no hero. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and he'd brought trouble to their quiet town. Even Sheriff Bradley was feeling the pressure. Silas Kane is a powerful man, Jack, he'd said, his face grim. He owns half the territory north of here. People are scared. They want you gone. I can't leave, Jack said, his voice tight. His men are watching the trails. They're waiting for me to run. Then what are you going to do? They'll come for you, sooner or later. Jack knew the sheriff was right. A frontal assault wasn't Kane's style. He preferred psychological warfare. He was turning the town into a cage, isolating Jack, making him a pariah. Kane wanted him cornered, desperate, and alone. The second obstacle came in the form of a lone rider, a man with cold, empty eyes who rode into town and delivered a message to the sheriff. Silas Kane himself was on his way. He was coming to personally oversee the capture of the man who had wronged him. He would arrive in 2 days. The news settled over the small room in the boarding house like a death shroud. Catherine, now able to sit up in bed, listened as Jack explained the impossible truth. He used us, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. He used my grief, my daughter, all to get to you. Her eyes searched his face. What did you do to him, Jack? Why does he hate you this much? Jack looked away toward the window, his gaze lingering on the horizon, as if searching for ghosts. The time for half-truths was over. His name isn't Silas Kane, it's Silas Kane. His brother was Robert Kane. He served with me in the cavalry. He told her everything. The ambush in Arizona, Robert's wound, the order to retreat, the choice he had made to save himself and leave his friend behind. I followed orders, he finished, his voice hollow. But it doesn't change the fact that I left him to die. Silas must have found out. He blames me, and he spent years planning his revenge. Catherine was silent for a long time. She looked at this man who had saved her life, this man her daughter adored, and saw not a killer or a coward, but a man haunted by a single impossible choice. She reached out and took his hand. "You survived," she said softly. "That's not a crime." "To him it is," Jack said grimly. He knew he couldn't wait for Kane to arrive. To stay in Millhaven would be to sign their death warrants and endanger everyone in the town. He had to draw Kane out away from innocent people to a place of his own choosing, a place where the odds might be evened. "There's an old abandoned silver mine in the hills west of here," he said, a plan forming in his mind. "The Widow's Maw. It's a maze of tunnels and shafts. Dangerous country. A good place to make a stand." "We make a stand?" Catherine asked, her chin rising with that familiar, stubborn fire. "You're not doing this alone, Jack." "Catherine, it's too dangerous. He wants me, not you. He used my family to get to you. He stood by while his men murdered my husband. This is my fight, too." She squeezed his hand. "Besides," she added, a faint smile touching her lips, "families don't abandon each other. Isn't that what you said?" Emma, who had been listening from the foot of the bed, her face solemn, came to his side. She slipped her small hand into his. "You're not going away, are you, Papa Jack?" she asked, her voice small and worried. "You're not going to leave us like my first papa did?" The simple, terrified question cut through his resolve. He knelt and pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her hair. The scent of soap and sunshine filled his senses. This was what he was fighting for. Not just atonement for his past, but a chance at a future. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to face this together. And when it's over, we're going to find a piece of land and build a life. Just like we talked about." He looked up at Catherine over Emma's head. "But we do it my way. I go to the mine. I draw them in. You and Emma stay with Sheriff Bradley. He'll get you out of town when the shooting starts. You ride south and don't look back." Her eyes flashed with protest, but she saw the iron will in his face. This was a line he would not cross. He would face Kane, but he would not risk them. After a long, tense moment, she nodded her assent. The farewell was quiet, stolen in the pre-dawn darkness of the following day. Jack held Emma for a long moment, the little girl clinging to him, her face buried in his neck. "You be good for your mama," he whispered. "You come back," she whispered back, her voice fierce. He then turned to Catherine. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. He reached out his hand, cupping her cheek. "Survive," he said. It was both a command and a plea. She leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his. "So do you, Jack Rourke," she replied, her voice husky. "You come back to us." He didn't trust himself to speak again. He simply nodded, turned, and slipped out into the darkness, a lone figure heading toward a final, desperate confrontation with his past. Brahif. The storm broke as Jack reached the mine, a furious biblical deluge that turned the sky to bruised charcoal. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, and thunder cracked overhead like the sky splitting apart. Lightning bleached the landscape in stark, momentary flashes, illuminating the skeletal headframe of the widow's maw and the dark, gaping entrance to the tunnels. It was a fitting backdrop for what was to come. He didn't have to wait long. He saw them through the driving rain, 4 riders approaching the mine. Silas Kane, flanked by 3 of his most trusted men. They dismounted their slickers gleaming in the storm and moved toward the mine entrance with confident purpose. Jack had left a clear trail, an open invitation. The trap was set. He faded back into the labyrinth of tunnels, the darkness a comforting shroud. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet rock and forgotten history. He knew these tunnels. He'd explored them on a previous ride through the territory. He knew the dead ends, the treacherous shafts, the places where a man could disappear forever. He let them come deep inside before he made his first move. He used the thunder to mask his footsteps, the labyrinthine tunnels to confuse and separate them. The first man died without a sound, a knife sliding between his ribs in a narrow passage. The second fell to a single well-aimed shot from Jack's Colt, the sound of the gunshot swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. The third was more cautious. He sensed the trap backtracking, calling out for his companions. Jack hunted him through the disorienting dark, a ghost moving through the rock. The chase ended at the edge of a deep, black ventilation shaft. A brief, brutal struggle in the flickering light of a dropped lantern, and the man's scream was cut short as he plunged into the abyss. Now it was just him and Silas. Jack could feel his presence, a cold, malevolent intelligence moving through the darkness. The hunter had become the hunted. Rourke Silas's voice echoed through the tunnels, eloquent and laced with cold amusement. You can't hide in the dark forever. Penance is at hand. The wages of sin are death, as the good book tells us. Jack remained silent, reloading his Colt, his ears straining for any sound. He heard a scuffling noise from a tunnel to his left, followed by a child's frightened gasp. Ice flooded his veins. Emma. He burst into the main chamber, a large cavern where several tunnels converged. Silas Kane was standing in the center, a lantern at his feet, casting long, dancing shadows. He wasn't alone. He held Emma in front of him, a small, struggling shield. One of his men, whom Jack had presumed dead, stood behind him holding a terrified Catherine, a gun pressed to her head. The man must have circled back, gone to the town, and taken them from Bradley. It was a trap within a trap. I learned a long time ago never to underestimate a man's capacity for sentimentality. Silas said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He was a handsome man, refined, his clothes expensive even under the grime of the trail. But his eyes were devoid of all warmth, all mercy. You ran, Rourke. You left my brother to die alone in the dirt, to be butchered by savages. For that, there must be an accounting. It was a war, Kane. Jack said, his voice low, his gun held steady. People die. Choices are made. You made the wrong one. Silas hissed, his composure cracking for the first time, revealing the raw grief and rage beneath. Robert worshipped you. He trusted you. And you left him. Now you will feel what it's like to have everything you care about ripped away. He tightened his grip on Emma, and she cried out. Let them go, Jack said, taking a step forward. This is between you and me. Oh, it is, Silas agreed. And this is how it ends. He looked at Jack, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Here is your final choice, Jack Rourke. Your penance. Drop your gun. Kick it away. Accept your fate and die for your sins. Do that and the woman and child live. They will be free to go. But if you raise that gun, if you try to fight my man, we'll kill the mother, and I will snap this little girl's neck. Your soul or their lives. Choose. The ultimatum hung in the cavern, a monstrous, impossible choice. The thunder roared outside, a chorus for his damnation. He looked at Catherine's terrified face, at Emma's tear-streaked cheeks. He saw the ghosts of his past, Norbert married Thomas, their faces accusing him. All his life, he had run from the consequences of his choices. But there was no running now. His guilt was a physical weight crushing him. Silas was right. He deserved to die. His survival had cost Robert his life. His absence had cost him his family. It was time to pay the debt. Slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat, he lowered his gun. He could see the triumph flare in Silas's eyes. He bent to place the Colt on the ground, but as he did, his eyes met Catherine's. He saw no judgment there, no condemnation. He saw love. And he saw a flicker of movement, a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had kept her alive in the desert. She wasn't giving up, and she wouldn't let him. In that instant, everything became clear. Atonement wasn't about dying for your past. It was about living for your future. His movement was a blur. Instead of placing the gun down, he dropped to one knee, simultaneously kicking a loose rock at the lantern. The cavern was plunged into absolute darkness. The man holding Catherine grunted in surprise. Silas swore. Jack fired twice. He didn't aim with his eyes, but with his instincts, with the memory of where they had been standing. The first shot was for the man holding Catherine. He heard a cry of pain and the thud of a body falling. The second shot was for Silas. A flash of lightning illuminated the cavern for a split second. It was a tableau from hell. The henchman was on the ground. Catherine was scrambling for Emma, and Silas was staggering back, a dark stain spreading on his chest, his face a mask of disbelief. He was still holding Emma. Papa Jack, Emma screamed. Silas snarled, raising his own pistol, aiming it not at Jack, but at the child in his arms. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired again and again, emptying his Colt, the shots echoing like cannon fire in the enclosed space. Silas was thrown backward by the force of the impacts, his grip on Emma finally broken. The little girl tumbled to the ground, unharmed. Silas Kane slid down the rock wall, his malevolent eyes fixed on Jack, a final curse on his lips before his head slumped to his chest. Silence descended, broken only by the sound of the rain and Emma's ragged sobs. Jack stumbled through the darkness toward the sound of Emma's crying. He was wounded. A searing pain in his shoulder told him one of Silas's bullets had found its mark, but he ignored it. He found them huddled together, Catherine holding a sobbing Emma in her arms. "It's over," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. He knelt and pulled them both into an embrace, the three of them, a small, trembling unit of survival, in the echoing dark of the mine. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. Sheriff Bradley and a posse of townsmen and their torches, a welcome sight, found them at the mouth of the mine an hour later. Bradley had grown suspicious when Kane's man had come for Catherine and Emma and had followed them. He took in the scene, Jack pale and bleeding. Catherine and Emma shaken but safe. The bodies inside the mine and his weary eyes held a newfound respect. "Looks like you handled things," he said simply. The truth came out pieced together from Jack's reluctant testimony, and letters found in Silas Kane's saddlebags, letters from his brother Robert that spoke of Jack not as a coward, but as a hero who had tried to save him. The official story became one of self-defense. The bounty was rescinded. The town of Millhaven, their fear replaced by shame, and then admiration, saw Jack not as a killer, but as a protector. They offered him a home, a place in their community. But the ghosts of the widow's maw were too loud. They needed a fresh start, a place where the earth wasn't soaked in blood and memory. They traveled north into the green rolling hills of Montana and found a small abandoned homestead nestled in a valley by a clear running creek. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over them. The cabin was small, but with their combined efforts, it had become a home. Jack, his shoulder healed to a dull ache, had repaired the roof and fenced in a pasture. Catherine had planted a garden, turning the soil with the same determined hope her husband James must have had. Emma, her laughter once again bright and frequent, had claimed every chicken cow and barn cat as her own personal responsibility. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in strokes of gold and rose, they stood together on the small plot of land they now called their own. The air was cool and clean-smelling of pine and damp earth. Jack held the small wooden bird Emma had carried through their ordeal. He had carefully repaired a crack in its wing and repainted its faded colors. He walked into the cabin and stood before the rough-hewn mantel above the stone fireplace. From his own saddlebag, he took a small silver locket tarnished with age. He opened it, revealing the tiny faded portraits of a smiling woman and a small boy, Mary and Thomas. For 3 years he had kept it hidden, a secret shrine to his own failure. Now, with Catherine and Emma watching from the doorway, he placed the open locket on one end of the mantel. Then he took the small wooden bluebird, Emma's father's last gift to her, and set it gently on the other end. The two symbols of love and loss, past and present, stood together in the warm light of the cabin. It was not an act of replacement, but of integration, an acceptance that his old family and his new one could share the same space in his heart. He wasn't hiding his past anymore. He was building a future that could hold it. Emma came and stood beside him, her small hand slipping into his. She looked from the locket to the bird, her young face filled with a wisdom beyond her years. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she leaned her head against his side, a gesture of complete belonging. "Papa," she said, the word no longer a child's desperate claim on a stranger, but a simple, profound statement of fact. Jack put his arm around her, pulling her close. His gaze met Catherine's across the room. In her eyes, he saw not the shadow of the husband she had lost, but the promise of a future they would build together. There were no more words needed. The silence was filled with the quiet, resilient strength of a family forged not by blood, but by courage, sacrifice, and the stubborn, improbable grace of a second chance. They had found their happiness not because it was easy, but because they had chosen to build it together from the broken pieces of their lives.